Hi, everybody. Meteorologist Matt Gray back here with another edition of the Brainstorm. And today I wanted to talk about something that we've actually seen the past week or so around the inland Northwest, and that is falling snow when the temperature is above freezing. Now, this on the screen right here, this is our chart that we show you every year about different types of wintry precipitation. You get a little freezing layer near the ground, and you can get some weird stuff like freezing rain and like sleet. But for the most part, when you have a deep layer of air that's above freezing near the ground, you end up with rain. And when it's freezing all the way down to the ground, you end up with snow. But that last part, that's a little bit deceiving because after all, we've seen it. 35, 36, 38 degrees, and it is still snow coming down from the sky. The first method that happens, it's the most obvious, right? It's just a very shallow layer of that warm air, and the snow doesn't have enough time to melt before it hits the ground. Now, usually it'll melt on contact. We saw that on Tuesday before the Arctic air showed up last week here as I record this on February 26th, 2023. It's the other one on the other side of your screen that's a lot more interesting, and that is some deeper warm air that the snow falls through and manages to get all the way to the ground. And if the snow is actually falling heavy enough, it will actually even start to stick. And so this is a really interesting type of process, and it all has to do with the fact that, well, snowflakes, frozen water, and when you're heating up or cooling down water, it takes a lot of energy, and in this case, it takes a lot of heat. So let's take a little zoom in, a little snowflake falling through some air well above freezing. And what's happening here is that the warm air is going to try and push its way into the snowflake, and that energy from that warm air is going to melt it slowly but surely. Meanwhile, what's happening here is, well, since that heat is being used to melt that snowflake, that means the air around the snowflake is cooling down. So there is a heat exchange through any sort of this kind of process, whether you're evaporating water out of a lake on a hot summer day, whether you're melting snow, whether you're freezing up snow. But in this case, what happens to the air around the snowflake as the snowflake takes in that heat and begins to melt is that the air starts to cool. This is called evaporative cooling. And in certain cases, because of this, snow can make it all the way down to the ground. As I mentioned, if it's heavy enough, it can stick. So you can see snow in certain cases all the way into the low 40s. Now, the one thing here is that you have to be in the right belt of humidity, right? So we're exchanging water vapor, right, when we're doing this. And that is the key here. In fact, when they're talking about making snow up at the ski areas, this is a big thing that they have to look for. If it's too humid and too warm, they're not going to be able to make good snow. It's going to be wet and sloppy and gross. No, they need cold ice crystals coming out of those snow guns. And so this is a snow making chart. And you can see here, as you get into those low humidities, that less than 50%, which fairly common around here, even in the wintertime, you can easily get, if you get snow during that time period, falling into that dry, warm air, anything between 32 and in extreme cases where it is super, super dry, as high as 42 degrees. I think that's a little bit unlikely around here. I think we really only get that dry in the wintertime when we've got Arctic air pushing in, or even get close to that. But what's the interesting thing here is kind of that middle range where you can get that 20, 30, 40 to 50% humidity where, yeah, you can get into the 30s, into the mid and upper 30s and still be able to get snow down to the ground, actually see the air temperature cool off as that snow falls through it, because you are heating up the snow, you're melting it, you're creating water vapor, and the air is dry enough that it's able to kind of, this is not a perfect analogy, but it's able to kind of carry that excess moisture and a way to describe this is what's called the wet bulb temperature. When we were in school, we used to have, we wet down a rag and we sling this thing around, and that's how we would get, hey, what's the temperature if we took the humidity all the way up to 100%. And so when you talk about evaporative cooling, when you're talking about the heat index and how hot it feels like during the summer when it's really muggy and humid, those are the kind of things that the wet bulb temperature is very useful for, and this is just a great example of that. So evaporative cooling and very shallow layers of warm air, those are the ways that you can get some snow above 32 degrees. I think we're going to see a lot of that in the upcoming week as we see more storm systems push in across the inland northwest. So thanks for joining me on this edition of the Brainstorm. Go ahead, like, share, subscribe to the 4 News Now YouTube channel with your latest local inland northwest headlines. Plus, every week we'll give you some cool science behind the weather or some deep dives into forecasts, and we have some impactful weather on the way. So I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of the Brainstorm. It is not always a perfect picture. There's always exceptions to the rule when it comes to weather, and that is snow included. Thanks for watching.